In July of 1518, a woman in Strasbourg stepped into the street and started dancing. She didn't stop. Not that hour, not that night, not the next day. Within a week, 34 more people had joined her. Within a month, it was hundreds. People danced until their feet bled. Some danced until their hearts gave out. And the city's official response was to hire more musicians. Her name was Frau Troffea. On a July morning in the Alsatian city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, she walked outside her home and began to dance in the street. No music, no festival, no explanation. Her husband reportedly begged her to stop. She didn't. She kept going for somewhere between 4 and 6 days straight, collapsing from exhaustion, then getting back up to dance again the moment she could stand. Neighbors assumed it was a private, temporary madness. It wasn't. Within a week, contemporary records say 34 other people had joined her, dancing alone or in small clusters through the streets with the same wild, involuntary energy. City physicians were called in to examine the growing crowd. They ruled out demonic possession, ruled out drunkenness, and reached a diagnosis that made complete sense within their medical framework. The dancers were suffering from overheated blood, a fever of the body that needed to be worked out through exertion. The prescribed treatment, endorsed by the city's own physicians, was more dancing. Strasbourg's authorities didn't try to stop the dancing. They organized it. The city council cleared out the grain market and cattle market to create open dancing space. Guild halls were opened up. Workers built wooden stages so the afflicted could dance without colliding with each other in the crowded streets. The council hired professional musicians, drummers, and pipers, and paid them to keep a constant rhythm going, day and night. They even brought in strongmen, hired specifically to dance alongside the afflicted and, if the dancers began to falter, physically hold them upright so they could keep moving. It was a public health strategy built entirely backward, and the city paid for it out of municipal funds. Officials genuinely believed that suppressing the urge to dance would trap the fever inside the body and make the affliction worse. So instead of restraining the dancers, the city funded and staged the very behavior that was killing them, turning a medical emergency into what looked, from a distance, like an elaborate civic festival, complete with a paid house band. By August, historical accounts describe as many as 400 people dancing through Strasbourg's streets at the peak of the outbreak, filling the very stages the city had built for them. Chroniclers describe dancers collapsing mid-step, only to be dragged aside, revived, and left to rejoin the crowd once they could stand. Local physicians reported a rising death toll. Some surviving sources claim as many as 15 people a day were dying at the height of the crisis, from strokes, heart attacks, and sheer physical exhaustion. There was no clear pattern to who was affected: men and women, the young and the elderly, tradespeople and the destitute. People danced past the point of physical collapse, some with feet bloodied through worn-out shoes, some in near-total silence apart from their own ragged breathing. The local clerk Daniel Specklin, writing about the events decades later, described it as one of the strangest and most disturbing episodes the city had ever recorded, and noted that authorities were, by that point, genuinely at a loss for what to do. By late summer, city officials quietly abandoned the hot blood theory. If dancing was supposed to cure the affliction, the mounting body count made it obvious that the treatment was making things worse, not better. Authorities shifted to a religious explanation instead. This wasn't a disease of the body at all, but a curse sent down by an offended saint. The suspect was Saint Vitus, a 3rd-century Christian martyr who had, by the medieval period, become the patron saint of dancers, actors, and entertainers, and was also the saint people prayed to for protection against epilepsy and nervous disorders. Folk belief held that if you angered Saint Vitus, or failed to properly observe his feast day, he could curse you with compulsive, uncontrollable dancing as divine punishment. Acting on that belief, the city loaded the afflicted onto carts and transported them roughly 25 miles to a shrine dedicated to the saint in the nearby town of Saverne. There, they were dressed in consecrated red shoes, sprinkled with holy water, and made to walk in slow circles around a wooden statue of Saint Vitus as priests prayed over them. Slowly, through the month of September, the outbreak finally faded. Historians still don't fully agree on what actually happened. The most cited culprit for decades was ergotism, poisoning from a fungus called Claviceps purpurea that grows on damp rye and can trigger convulsions and hallucinations. It's a real and documented hazard of the era. The problem is that ergot poisoning restricts blood flow to the extremities. It's genuinely difficult to see how it could produce coordinated dancing across 400 people for weeks, rather than seizures and physical collapse. The theory with the most traction today is mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, a genuine stress-induced condition that can spread through a population sharing the same cultural framework and fears. Historian John Waller, who has studied the Strasbourg outbreak more extensively than almost anyone, points out that 1518 was a catastrophic year for the region even before the dancing began. Famine had driven grain prices to crushing highs. A smallpox epidemic had recently swept through, and syphilis, a relatively new and terrifying disease in Europe at the time, was spreading fast. On top of all that, the population genuinely and fervently believed Saint Vitus had the power to curse them with uncontrollable dancing. Waller's argument is that extreme, sustained psychological stress, combined with a real and deeply held cultural belief in the curse, was enough to trigger an involuntary, self-sustaining episode that spread from person to person the way a panic spreads through a crowd, not through any pathogen, but through shared terror and shared belief. Strasbourg's outbreak in 1518 is the most thoroughly documented, but it was far from the first, and it wouldn't be the last. A similar episode struck Aachen in 1374 and spread with startling speed along the Rhine, reaching Cologne, Metz, and a string of other cities across the Holy Roman Empire within weeks. Chroniclers writing at the time described crowds numbering in the hundreds, dancing uncontrollably through the streets for days on end, some reportedly screaming about visions or crying out that they were drowning in blood. These episodes tended to cluster around the feast days of St. John and St. Vitus, which only reinforced the popular belief that the saints themselves were responsible and made each new outbreak feel like a confirmation of the last one, rather than a strange coincidence. Over roughly 3 centuries, historical records reference at least 10 distinct outbreaks of compulsive, involuntary dancing across medieval Europe, almost every one of them occurring in communities that were already under serious social, economic, or physical strain. The folklore around St. Vitus outlived the outbreaks themselves. By the 18th century, physicians had borrowed the name St. Vitus's dance for an entirely different condition, Sydenham's chorea, a neurological disorder caused by childhood rheumatic fever that produces involuntary, jerking movements of the face and limbs. It's an unrelated illness with a real, identifiable physical cause rooted in autoimmune inflammation, but it inherited the folkloric name because the involuntary, jerking, dance-like movements looked, to observers separated by centuries, like the same affliction wearing a different face. The name stuck in medical textbooks and diagnostic manuals well into the 20th century, a strange linguistic fossil left behind by a curse nobody involved in medicine still believed in. Mass psychogenic illness didn't end in the 16th century, and it isn't a medieval curiosity. In 2011, a group of teenage girls at a high school in Leroy, New York, began developing sudden, involuntary tics, twitches, and verbal outbursts with no identifiable medical cause. It became a national news story. State health officials and outside neurologists investigated extensively, testing for environmental toxins and infections, and ultimately concluded it was a modern, well-documented instance of the same underlying phenomenon behind the Strasbourg outbreak. Earlier still, in 1962, an outbreak of uncontrollable laughing and crying spread through a girls' boarding school in Tanzania, then Tanganyika. It lasted for months, spread to neighboring schools and villages as students were sent home, and eventually forced the original school to shut its doors entirely. Researchers today understand these events as a real, physically manifesting neurological and psychological response to extreme collective stress. Not a hoax, not a performance, not fraud. The body producing something the conscious mind can't otherwise express or escape, spreading person to person through a group that shares the same underlying fears and beliefs. Strasbourg in 1518 may be the strangest and most lethal version on record, but it was never the only one. And it likely won't be the last. In July of 1518, a woman in Strasbourg started dancing and couldn't stop. Neither could the hundreds of people who followed her. The city didn't understand it. The doctors didn't understand it. And 5 centuries later, we still argue about what it actually was. What we do know is this. Sometimes the body carries what the mind can't say out loud, and in a summer of famine and disease, an entire city danced itself into history.